Hello, everyone. We're glad you could join us today for our first training webinar on the topic of human trafficking. We look forward to an informative presentation from our colleagues with the Department of Homeland Security Investigations, also known as HSI. My name is Janelle Porter, Fraud Officer in NCUA's Office of Examination and Insurance, and I'll be your moderator for today's webinar. We are excited to have our chairman here with us today to provide some opening remarks, but first, let's cover a few administrative items. So that you can hear this webinar well, please adjust the volume on your computer or consider using external speakers. To resize the windows on your screen, drag the bottom right-hand corner of any box you wish to resize. You will need to allow pop-ups from this website, and we will have a Q&A session at the end of this webinar, so please use the Ask a Question feature on your console to send in any questions that you may have. Finally, an archived version of this presentation along with a copy of the slides will be made available in a few weeks using the same link that you used to register today. Here's a disclaimer I'll read quickly before we jump into things. The materials presented in this webinar intend to serve as an informative and educational summary of general information related to human trafficking concerns. Reference to any specific organization, commercial product, process, service, view, or opinion expressed does not constitute an endorsement, recommendation, reflection, or favoring by the United States government, the NCUA, or the NCUA board. Today, we will begin with some remarks from our chairman, the Honorable Rodney E. Hood. After the chairman's remarks, we will spend a few minutes discussing the recent NCUA board action for a notice of proposed rulemaking on SAR exemptions, and then begin with some introductions of our guests from Homeland Security Investigations and the Knoble. Following that, we will conclude with the Q&A session. As I mentioned, we have the privilege of having the NCUA chairman with us today. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to the Honorable Rodney E. Hood.
Great. Well, thank you for that kind introduction. Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. Today, we're providing training in collaboration with our law enforcement partners and stakeholders focused on the eradication of human trafficking. Human trafficking can come in many forms, from child exploitation to sex trafficking to forced labor. It exists in the shadows and is responsible for extreme human suffering here in the United States and sadly around the world. As with other illegal and illicit activities, criminals need to manipulate the financial system to launder and move ill-gotten gains and monetize their illegal activities. As stakeholders and operators of the U.S. financial system, we all have an opportunity to make a difference by disrupting the illicit financing activities of human traffickers and assisting law enforcement to hold them accountable for their nefarious crimes. Today, in conjunction with our law enforcement partners and industry stakeholders, we will be providing valuable information that may help you all identify and report suspected illicit financial activity emblematic of the patterns and behaviors of human traffickers, and this in turn will help you all make a difference in your local communities and in this great country. I am pleased we have this opportunity today and assure you that NCUA is committed to working closely in partnership with law enforcement and industry stakeholders to put an end to the pain and suffering caused by human trafficking in the United States and around the globe. So again, welcome. Thank you for joining us, and I look forward to a very lively and enlightening conference call or training session today. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Before we get into our human trafficking training for today, we also want to bring a recent board action to your attention. The board recently approved a proposed rulemaking on a BSA exemption for SAR filings. This proposed rulemaking would allow for federally insured credit unions to request the NCUA's approval of SAR filing exemptions in instances when credit unions develop innovative solutions to meet BSA requirements more efficiently and effectively. Additionally, it would also make it possible for the NCUA to grant exemptions in conjunction with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network to federally insured credit unions that develop this innovative solutions to meet their BSA requirements. This will be published in the Federal Register in the near future, and the other federal banking agencies are proposing similar rulemakings. We want to make sure everyone is aware of this proposed rule and encourage you to provide feedback during the public comment period. Turning back to our topic for today, I'll give a quick introduction of our speakers. From NCUA's Office of Examination and Insurance, we have BSA officers Andrew Bludorn and Cindy Johnson, as well as myself. And we're happy to welcome John Tobon from the Department of Homeland Security's Homeland Security Investigations Unit, where he is a special agent in charge of Hawaii, Guam, the Northern Mariana Islands, and the Western Pacific Islands. To introduce Zach Tobon and to explain the relationship between the Knoble and Homeland Security Investigations is Sean Holtzclaw, Executive Director of the Knoble. Sean, I'll turn it over to you to get started.
Hey, Janelle, thank you so much, and welcome everyone. I'm Sean Holtzclaw. I'm Executive Director of the Knoble, and I want to thank Chairman Hood and the NCUA for the opportunity to talk about what we're doing to protect vulnerable populations around the world. The fight that we face is significant, and it's what you see in front of you. The vision of the Knoble, a nonprofit organization, is very simple. We do not believe that anyone should profit from the suffering of others. And the vulnerable populations that exist are extensive. If you look at these numbers, they're stark. The number of human trafficking individuals subject to human trafficking right now is well over 40 million people. When you consider the lockdown, unfortunately, we don't have the numbers from the global lockdown yet, but that 40 million number will unfortunately increase. The bad actors that are in the world leveraging the networks that exist profit well. It's estimated that they profit well over $150 billion on an annual basis. They're also exploiting the young and the old in addition to the weak. Too many of our children are subject to being abused or exploited, as well as our elders being scammed. There's other vulnerable populations as well, but many of them are subject to this issue and are subject to human trafficking. And that's why we formed the Knoble. The Knoble is a nonprofit network of financial crime, financial and fintech professionals with a passion for protecting vulnerable people around the world. We work with senior individuals in the financial systems and the law enforcement systems around the world for the purpose of focusing on how we put the victims at the center of what we do when we fight financial crime. We believe that something has to be done differently. What I didn't say before was, unfortunately, just as an example, we're not winning this fight. It's estimated that less than 0.5% of those subject to human trafficking are being protected and rescued. So we have to do something differently. We humbly believe that we have to do something differently together. And that's why the Knoble works through people networks of subject matter experts such as yourself, data and technology, and cross-industry networks, partnering very closely with public, private, and other charitable organizations. That's how, in fact, we came across working with John and Homeland Security. But let me expand on this just a little bit. If you think for just a moment of the vast network of criminal enterprises that exist around the world and how they work with and in our financial and other systems. They work in real time, and they work through networks, and they look for vulnerabilities. We believe that the only way to counter this is to counter it with the networks and the subject matter experts that exist already. Around the world, there are laws, there are policies, there are governments, there are regulations, there are oversight bodies such as the NCUA and others. There are law enforcement professionals, data, fintech, financial crime, and other professionals who go to work every day for the purpose of stopping fraud and crime. What we believe we need to do is to help leverage and equip and train and deploy the hundreds of thousands of subject matter experts, such as yourself around the world, to stop this in a systemic way. We'll use data and technology to do that and use cross-industry networks to come together. Let me share with you an example of that. These are initiatives that we believe are prioritized for us for 2021. There are many others that are going on, but I just pull these out to highlight. When you think about the network that exists across the world, that network could also be used to fight it. It can't be one and done. It has to be repeated action. But let's use an example. We all go out to dinner. We get our phone. We get a text. The text says, "Did you make this charge?" And we look at it and go, yes or no. And if we say no, in real time, we have found fraud. What we need to do together is to look at what's behind that fraud. What criminal enterprise created that fraud and what victim is being abused behind it? How do we take that next step in our current roles and across our networks for the purpose of saying we're not just going to stop the credit card, but we're also going to stop the crime. We believe that there's a life cycle of change that is needed in order to move our work, our time, and our efforts more toward detection, and prevention rather than just victim assistance. Unfortunately, once these crimes are committed, they're horrific to the people involved. It's rare that we ever get back to wholeness with them. So the more that we can do to detect and prevent that financial crime and cut the head off the snake, so to speak, in advance, the more that we do for all of us. You see some examples of some of the policy, detection, prevention, victim assistance, partnerships, and data and tech enablement that we're doing. There's more information on our website. And so let me leave you with the ability for us to get to John and to him to talk about some of the key indicators and red flags that exist in human trafficking. But let me just share with you, if this is something that resonates with you personally and as a professional, please feel free to visit our website. There's no charge to sign up. Please join the fight. On our homepage, you'll see the ability just to sign up with your email, and you'll receive our updates and what we're doing and the actions that we're taking and the initiatives that are involved. We also have the ability for you to follow us on LinkedIn. And for those of you who would like to give back and learn more about what's happening to fight and protect vulnerable populations, you can see the Take Action button on the top right of the website. Feel free to give us some information about yourself, and we'll keep you more involved in what we're doing and find opportunities for you to become more engaged. So with that, I would love to turn it over to John. You see his impressive credentials, and I won't go through all of them here, but it has been an absolute privilege for me to be able to work with professionals such as John and others at Homeland Security and other law enforcement organizations. We came together earlier this year when we brought together a bunch of public and private and charitable organizations. There were over 130 professionals in over 65 organizations, including 10 different law enforcement agencies led primarily by Homeland Security investigations. We put together our view of priority issues that we needed to face. When we looked at all of them, one of the things that we looked at was the importance of looking at these red flag indicators. And so with that, John, I just want to thank you for the ability to work with someone like you. Thank you for what you do for us, and let me turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Sean, and good morning, everybody. For me, good afternoon for you guys. I'm very appreciative of the opportunity to work with the Knoble and be able to team up with Janelle and NCUA to bring this information to all of you. I think this is one of those issues that is very different from the traditional AML issues that all of you have been dealing with for your entire career. This is the one issue that you can actually run into on the street. You can run into this issue in your personal life. Your children and the children in your community are exposed to this danger. So this is something that it's so much different from all of the other AML training that you will be receiving or that you have received, or some of the other topics. And it's because of how this type of crime is pervasive in our community. But when you often hear the term hidden in plain sight, it sounds like a cliche, but it is so true that a lot of this is happening when we go out into our community, when we walk down the street, when we go into a restaurant, all of these different activities as you drive through your communities. This is happening in your community, and it does not matter whether you live in an affluent community or not so affluent community. If you're just driving through, a challenged community or a community that is on the upswing, it is as prevalent there as it is in the communities that have all of the resources available to them. And that's some of the things that I will go through today. We'll go through this not necessarily to make each and every single one of you experts on identifying human trafficking. That's impossible. What I do want to leave with you at the end of this entire presentation is the realization that This is happening. It is happening in your community. It is happening in your institutions. It is a matter of figuring out exactly what is it that you need to look at and how to analyze the information that you have available. Because what you will also learn is that the telltale signs, the red flags, the clues that are left behind by this activity are significantly different from the other type of clues and red flags that are left from other types of money laundering. And so, as Sean alluded to, this is something that is not a small, chic, unique type of crime. This type of crime is actually very complex. It's more complex than the name even implies, because when you think of human trafficking, when I say the words human trafficking, I guarantee you that your mind goes to one place, right? And it's not because you have a dirty mind, but it automatically goes to sex trafficking, right? Because that seems to be where we are conditioned to think about when we mention the words human trafficking. But the crime is so much more complex than that. This crime is part of a complex set of crimes that are controlled and driven by very, very astute and resource-rich criminal organizations that operate not just overseas, as many people tend to think, but they operate here. They operate in a transnational nature, which is the very essence of this offense. Now, when we're talking about human trafficking, and this is something that for you in the financial industry and in the BSA and AML world, this is not something that you need to be too keen on. But for us in the law enforcement, in terms of prosecution, this is, in order for us to prove a human trafficking charge, we have to prove that there was force, fraud, or coercion when it comes to either a commercial sex act or labor, right? And the labor portion of it is the one that I'm going to emphasize a little bit more because, again, we don't tend to think of human trafficking in the labor sector, or we tend to think of human trafficking in the labor sector as, people working in restaurants or out in the fields. But the labor portion of this also applies to commercial sex acts. So, for instance, can somebody involved in a consensual sale of sex, an adult that is, selling sex, can that person still be trafficked, even though there is, they're doing it and they want to do it, and this is what they've always wanted to do in life, this is their dream job? Well, yes, because there's still, labor laws apply to every single employment act in the country, regardless of whether it is legal or illegal labor. So think about that, right? If you are working, regardless of what you're doing, you still need the 40-hour work week. You still are entitled to overtime. You're still entitled to sick days. All of these different protections. You're still entitled to workman's compensation insurance, even if your job is to stand on a corner and sell drugs. It doesn't matter. It's a job, right? So the labor laws apply regardless of whether the job is legal or illegal. The activity that you're involved in is legal or illegal. And this is where, we begin to get down to differentiating between the sex trafficking and the forced labor. And again, you'll see that there is some overlap in terms of the activities involved in both sex trafficking and forced labor. And that is something that, from your perspective, from the perspective of a financial institution where you may have some of these businesses as your customers, again, this is how you begin to sort of scratch the surface, because on their face, you are, they're going to certainly look like legitimate businesses, but it has to, it has to get to that point where you're saying, okay, yes, a legitimate business will operate and have these particular expenses. They will have these particular type of transaction flow and transaction volume at different times, during the month, during a quarter, during a year, and that's how you're going to be able to identify the businesses that are not legitimate, right? And that's where some of the training that you guys already have, some of the training that you received throughout your educational life, and that made you fantastic candidates for the current positions that you have. That's how you can use those skills to target these individuals that are out there trying to look legitimate, but obviously are committing illegal acts. And so the numbers are very stark. There is, if you look at the average age of children that are trafficked are 15 years old. Now, for those of you that have had or have been 15, think of when you were 15 years old. You were like, yeah, 15-year-olds don't take direction from anybody. So how can they be? I mean, that you would think all sorts of rebellious sort of activity and thoughts, but that's the average age. That's at the point where most of these kids get recruited. And although most of the sex trafficking involves women and girls, there is a large and growing number of men and boys that are also involved in sex trafficking. And when it comes to labor, the victims of labor trafficking cut across pretty much all of society and all types of businesses. So it's not just the restaurants. It's not just the field work. There are all sorts of different types of activities that lead to forced labor. Now, the belief that trafficking only exists in Asia, or that the only individuals that are trafficked are foreign nationals that are brought into the U.S. Is actually a misconception and a very dangerous one, because this underscores or underestimates the danger that our own children, our own citizens face when it comes to trafficking. Most trafficking in the United States is actually of U.S. citizens. That is the biggest population of trafficking victims. Is actually foreigners are a minority in the United States when it comes to being victims of trafficking, both labor and sex. So again, hopefully that will begin to shape the way you view some of this and the way you view some of the activity that you may be seeing. And please remember this as we go through the red flags, so that you can begin to apply some of this. We've already mentioned that sex trafficking is the first thing we think of. However, labor trafficking is actually a bigger portion. I think it goes largely underreported for one very specific reason. Most of the labor trafficking does happen in a hidden form, or in a hidden, or it's more hidden away from the public, right? Because it's the people that are working in the back, in the kitchen, the people that are working in the fields, over near the farms, and not in the cities, and obviously the individuals that are involved in labor trafficking, the victims of labor trafficking, are necessarily kept away from interacting with people outside of that circle, right? Whereas people that are involved in sex trafficking, those victims, they necessarily have to interact with people that are not being sex trafficked, and that would be obviously the customers and the individuals that are involved with those types of transactions. And then lastly, just to make a very quick clarification in terms of what we're talking about when we're talking about trafficking, we're not talking about individuals that decided that they wanted to make a better life for themselves, so they paid somebody to smuggle them into the United States, and then they're here in an undocumented manner or illegally. That's not what we're talking about. Human trafficking, again, going back to the definition at the beginning of the presentation, involves force, fraud, or coercion, which means that these individuals are literally trapped. It's not their choice to be in this situation where, when you're talking about smuggling, an individual chooses to smuggle, to be part of a smuggling venture. When they get to their destination, they pay the individual that smuggled them, and then at that point, they shake hands, thank you very much, see you later, everybody goes their separate ways. With trafficking, that doesn't happen. Trafficking, number one, the other misconception with trafficking is that it involves movement from one place to another. A lot of trafficking, again, most trafficking, when it comes to in the U.S., the victim doesn't go anywhere. They are trafficked in the city that they lived in. Many, oftentimes, in the city that they grew up in the city that they've lived in, that their family has lived in for generations. Right? So, quick, just a couple of things to make sure that we focus on the right items and that we put a lot of this activity in the proper perspective. There is a plethora of federal agencies involved in the fight against human trafficking. And you can see that we all utilize our authorities and our resources to combat different segments of this very, very large, very, very complex problem. So there's a big portion of this that has to do with providing services to the victims and the survivors of human trafficking. And we'll talk a little bit about that towards the end. So that's where the HHS gets involved. State Department gets involved with campaigns to prevent foreigners from being trafficked into the U.S. and to make sure that we can collaborate with foreign law enforcement. And then obviously the rest of the agencies that are listed here, we all collaborate on the investigative portion of this to not just identify the victims, but identify the networks. And once we identify those networks, identify the criminal organizations that are behind them. And once we identify that, our aim is also to identify the assets that are gained through this activity. And again, this is not nickel and dime type of stuff. We're talking $150 billion a year. This is a criminal activity that is expected to overtake the earnings of drug traffickers in the next 20 years around the world. So just think about that. Think about how human traffickers are going to be able to literally buy and sell drug dealers. That's, that's sobering, because that tells you, number one, this is not going away. Number two, this is not small time. What has happened over the last 20 years or so is that there has been a recognition at the federal level for the importance of identifying victims of trafficking and obviously initiating prosecutions and large-scale investigations. But you can see for a very long time, nothing was happening, right? So from 1910 to 2000, it was just like, yeah, okay, things are happening, yeah, whatever. And I think this is a demonstration of how differently we have started to look at some of the criminal activity that has been involved in terms of labor regulation, labor laws, labor rights, as well as how we treat and how we view sex workers, right? And this is they say, prostitution is the world's oldest profession. which is fine. You know, we can argue that back and forth. However, this notion that this is what people want to do, that, hey, if somebody is involved in sex work, this is, you know, they're doing it, you know, willingly, so go ahead, you know, let them do what they do. The problem with that type of thinking is, okay, if that's what they want to do, they let them. Nobody's telling them not to. However, that means that their employer has some responsibilities towards them, right? So it's not about judging them for how they choose to earn their money. It's making sure that they are covered and that their employers abide by all of the rules. And obviously, we know that pimps are not going to abide by all of the labor regulations, right? I think that's pretty much a given. But we see that there's consistently an increase in the focus on making sure that we do this in a more efficient and in a more effective manner. And I think, you know, especially I think over the last 5 years or so, we have seen this come to the forefront. This is a topic of every single conference by every anti-money laundering business alliance, business group, or organization that you see. If you want to dive into how the U.S. is doing and some of the countries that are specific, you know, that are of special interest just because of their lack of compliance with some of the rules, the State Department publishes what is called the TIP report, the Trafficking in Persons report, and it's a way for us to see where the fight against human trafficking is around the world. So I mentioned that this was happening everywhere, that this was happening in every city in the U.S., every neighborhood within every city. And this is a heat map put together by the Polaris Project. And the Polaris Project is the NGO that actually runs the National Human Trafficking Hotline. And we will talk about them, and then we'll give you that number. But this is just based on the number of calls that they receive from throughout the nation into that hotline. And you can see where we have a lot of trafficking. And obviously in the major cities, tourism is also a big attraction. Or you will also see a lot of reporting around agricultural centers. So for financial institutions, obviously the primary vehicle to report any of this activity is utilizing the SARS and reporting to FinCEN. And this is something, again, if you go on the FinCEN website, FinCEN over the last 5 years or so has started to really focus or sharpen and clarify their guidance on reporting human trafficking red flags or including human trafficking as a checkbox in the SARS. So if you suspect that the activity that you're reporting about, that you're reporting on involves human trafficking, there's now actually a checkbox that you can go in. That's fairly new, but it has, it demonstrates how serious FinCEN is. FinCEN is about combating and helping law enforcement gather all of this information. This slide is a little bit controversial in the sense that this is a widely held belief just because of human nature, right? When you get a lot of people in a small place or in a specific place for a big event like this, the risks, not just for human trafficking, for a lot of other criminal activity, increases exponentially. And so this is something that, as you look and as you analyze the BSA data and you start to look at the risks within your customer base, this is something that absolutely comes into play. I think there are people that believe that, large events like the Super Bowl, where you see a lot more instances, and it's just a matter of, is it because it's happening more, or is it because law enforcement focuses and is looking for it more? So, but there is what is without question is that this type of events create a need in the marketplace, if you're going to look at this as a business, for certain types of activity and certain types of options in that marketplace that raise the risk for, again, not just human trafficking activity, but other types of criminal activity, to include fraud also, right? Because every type of criminal is aware of this. When it comes to the red flags, this is where this activity differs greatly from the other activities that you are looking for in terms of money laundering, right? Usually, you're looking for very large amounts. Here, the amounts are more normal. These, if you look at some of these amounts, they'll be the types of amounts that maybe you and I can have in our bank account, right? You go someplace, you go into dinner, you go and you'll see transactions for a couple of $100 here, a couple of $100 there, or a couple of $100 ATM withdrawal. So this does take a little bit more, or requires a more nuanced analysis of transactional data. It's not just looking for the $1 million wire transfer or the $20,000 withdrawal. This is not that simple. It also involves having a lot of information about your customers and analyzing that information to see whether or not it makes sense, right? And going a little bit deeper in terms of knowing your customers' habits. So, for instance, one of the primary ways in the sex trafficking arena to get customers, especially now in the internet age, right, is through digital advertising, digital media advertising, and posting of ads on very specific websites that cater to this type of activity, or subscribing to specific websites that provide information and reviews on this type of sex activity. So this is where, through your transactional review, you're going to have to look not just at the amount that is moving, but where is it moving to, and how often is it moving there, and what else is it moving to, right? So that's where I was. I just, I was talking about looking at not just the transactional data. There's also looking at how this world works. So a lot of the times you have pimps, individuals that are controlling multiple women that are bringing money. One of the biggest challenges to law enforcement is, yes, we can go out and we can arrest a pimp. We can take a pimp and we can put him away. But what ends up happening is, because this involves psychological control over these women, not just physical control, a lot of them will then also end up funding their pimps' accounts at different correctional institutions. So that's another way to look at it. So if you're going down like, okay, what should I be looking for? Well, the first thing you should be looking for is go ahead and look at the data of your customers and see where they're spending their money. If they're spending most of their money advertising or paying sites for advertising, and those sites are, that advertising is either the site or the advertising is of a sexual nature, then you want to take a good look at that account. If you see a lot of money going to correctional institutions, you're going to want to also take a look to see how often, the amounts. You want to look at who else may be sending money within, within your customer base to those accounts. Because again, this is that many to one type of analysis, right? Many people sending money to one account. That's the type of analysis that you need in order to begin to identify some of this. You also have lots of activity when it comes to travel, right? And if you have and a lot of this actually happens through business accounts. And hopefully now with the passage of this new beneficial owner law or rule that was just passed at the beginning of the month, we can begin to close some of the gaps here. But this is if you have a business account and you have individual that is utilizing that account, and you always see them paying for airline tickets, you always see that business account paying for hotel stays, that's normal if that's what the business does, right? So, again, this is about making sure that when we're talking about the KYC and the customer due diligence, well, okay, it's a business account. What do you do? What is your business? What is your product? Why do you travel? Because what's happening now is, all of these individuals, all of these organizations, all of these pimps, they're getting pretty smart. They go on the internet, they create an LLC, they take that LLC, they open up a bank account, they get that bank, they use that bank account, they get a credit card, and all of a sudden they're running an entire business, through that account. And the transactions would be 100% consistent if it were a legal business. If it's a legal business, then obviously the business has, business travel, business expenses. Okay, great. But they're not, right? They're hiding their activities behind that legal facade. And, it's not unusual for us to find that type of sophistication, because in today's world, in 2021, that really isn't that sophisticated, right? You can go online and create your own LLC for about $70, and you can have it in about, in under 45, in under an hour, you can incorporate, right? So, please make sure that you do not underestimate the sophistication behind some of these organizations. And when it comes to businesses that are involved in labor trafficking, a little bit different, right? Because these are actual businesses. These are businesses that, sure, yeah, I have a cleaning business, I have a landscaping business, I have an office cleaning service, I have a construction company, and the individuals come in and sure enough, they look like construction workers and they've been in the business for 30 years, and yeah, there's they're building contractors, and sure, they'll show you pictures. Look, I just built this, and this is what I can do. But on its face, they exist as a business. However, when it comes to the trafficking, what you need to look at is how employees are paid and what those transactions look like. Because if you have accounts where individuals come in and they withdraw cash from the account, that's a sign, right? When you have subcontractors, so hey, I got a big contract to clean that particular building, but I don't do the work. I'm subcontracting to this other business, and they're sending checks. They're paying, they're paying the subcontractor with a business check from their account. That looks like a legitimate transaction. Well, the question to ask is, okay, so who is behind that subcontractor? Because what we find is that subcontractor actually is a related entity, that there is a connection between the main account that gets the contracts and the account that is paying the workers. The other thing to look out for is making sure that these companies are paying all of the federal taxes and local taxes, and that there are no additional deductions, right? And this is something that less for the financial for the banking side, but more for the financial services side, so that if you're handling payroll for a particular company, or if you have payroll companies that you are servicing as banking customers, this is one of the big red flags, where individuals will be charged for, yes, this is your pay, you get paid, whatever, $1,000 for the week, but we're going to deduct your living, your rent for the week. We're going to deduct your food for the week. All of those deductions. That is how individuals that are trafficked. That's how they become indentured servants, right? Because it gets to the point where they owe more than what they're making, and at the end of the day, the entire paycheck really gets deducted down to nothing. The payroll caching is really one of the most severe and most obvious ways of detecting a lot of this trafficking activity, right? And this is they'll issue a paycheck, and then all of a sudden, all of the employee checks are going back into the business account. That doesn't make sense, right? And then this is, oh no, I'm just cashing them for my customers. So I think when it comes to a business, especially a business in 2021, especially in the U.S., which is a country that has, in terms of the unbanked population, is way better off than most countries around the world. That type of activity is something that you definitely want to take a look at. And we already spoke about wage deductions and the business expenditures, because this is, again, this is the type of knowledge that you bring in with all of your experience, because to analyze the business activities of these companies, and once you start looking at this through that lens, utilizing all of that knowledge, you will see that you will be able to identify those accounts that you may want to pay special attention to. You'll identify those transactions that you may want to ask a couple of questions from your customers about, and help you get through that facade that they want you to believe, to actually identify these transactions. So, I said the idea of this presentation was certainly not to go through this in 45 minutes and make you experts on identifying trafficking. This is a very complex crime perpetrated by very astute people that have a lot of resources and that are utilizing the latest and greatest techniques. Everything that's available to a traditional business is available to criminal organizations, and everything that's available to criminal organizations is obviously available to human traffickers. So their MOs, their modus operandi, are constantly changing. They are adapting to new technology. They're incorporating new technology. The way I recommend that you as individuals, and obviously as institutions, stay on top of what is happening and how these trends are evolving is by being proactive. And one of the ways that I propose is by monitoring the Blue Campaign website, which is a website that is sponsored by DHS that has a lot of educational material for all sorts of businesses, not just the financial industry, but this is also the type of information that you can pass on to your customers, that are involved in high-risk industries, to make sure that you do your part to give them all of the information they need so that they do not become unwitting participants in some kind of trafficking scenario. The SARs are are priceless, really, when it comes to criminal investigations. I know that it's difficult just because of the nature of the SARs and what is involved for law enforcement to tell you exactly, hey, this is, that report led to this particular activity. Trust me, we would love to do that. We don't do it because we don't want to put you in danger, right? It's one of those situations where if we expect bad guys to be upset with us, it's our job, right? That's what, when I get up in the morning, I'm like, okay, how can I upset a bad guy? What bad guy am I going to, whose day am I going to ruin? Which bad guy which bad guy day am I going to ruin today, right? That's my mission every single day. And if I can ruin a couple of bad guy days, more than one, then it's a really, really good day, right? But we understand that it is frustrating for financial institutions to not have the ability to follow through on what happened to that information. FinCEN obviously has a couple of different ways in which they generally communicate results without obviously disclosing which particular report led to which particular enforcement event. But I can assure you that federal law enforcement, not just HSI, but all of the federal law enforcement utilize the information in BSA data, the information in SARs every single day. There is no investigation that does not have some connection to a SAR for many different reasons. Some ways, it's a fantastic tool to find good addresses, not just the information in the SAR, but the information about the account that is contained within the headers and all of the other standardized fields in the SAR. All of that information is gold to us because it can help us put together this very complex puzzle that we're constantly trying to find pieces for all over the place. There's also the desire to get, again, as individuals and as institutions involved with supporting the effort to stop human trafficking, right? And this is something that as institutions and as individuals, we can all do. So if there is a suspicion of a trafficking event, this is the phone number and text number for the National Human Trafficking Hotline. And there you can also see the website where people are there 24/7 to provide immediate assistance to victims of human trafficking. This, some of the things that the people at the Human Trafficking Hotline are able to do is, obviously, the first one is they contact law enforcement right away. So we have a direct line with them. So whenever there is something that happens in any of our, in any jurisdiction around the country, they know exactly who to call in that jurisdiction, and that information is updated on a regular basis, right? So if there's a trafficking event within Hawaii, for instance, they call us, they call the local police departments, and we all receive that message, and then we're able to do that in pretty much real time. But they also do a lot for the victim. It may be a victim that needs to escape and needs to fly back home. It may be somebody that needs a place to stay for the night. It may be somebody that needs some kind of medical care or mental counseling. All of that is available through the Human Trafficking Hotline. And then lastly, there are other things that we can do. Again, we're involved in, HSI is involved in the fight to prosecute, but our goal is actually, in these investigations, is actually victim-centered, right? We want to make sure that our investigations do not re-victimize these individuals that have already suffered so much. One of the biggest things, one of the biggest challenges to having victims become survivors and having those survivors become advocates and become, sort of put their life back on track is the fact that traffickers specifically do things to damage the victim's credit rating. So in other words, when a trafficker takes a credit card, they will not put it in their name because, again, they're sophisticated. They know that if it's in their name, they're going to be the ones responsible for whatever happens on that account. So they will ask a victim, or they will make a victim. They don't really ask, right? They will make a victim go out and get a credit card, go out and get a loan, go out and do all of these things. And then months later, years later, we go out as law enforcement, we're able to identify that victim, we're able to rescue the victim, we're able to then put the victim and have them become survivors, but their credit rating is still pretty bad, which means what? With a bad credit rating, can you rent an apartment? Not really, right? With a bad credit rating, can you get a job? Depending on what type of job, right? So there are lots of different steps that are available for financial institutions to become proactive in helping survivors regain that creditworthiness so that they can then go back or take back their good name, they can take back their life, they can then go on to get past this, the victimization and become productive members of society again. This is there are different things that organizations can do. I encourage, all of the entities and that are listening to look into this possibility. This is a fantastic way to really not just know about the problem, not just identify the problem, but actually help the people, right? And it goes back to what Sean was talking about. These are the people that are suffering as a result of this. And the fact that they're no longer being trafficked, that's great, but it does not mean that they no longer suffer the effects of being a victim of trafficking. And financial credit or creditworthiness is one of the lingering impacts of being a victim of trafficking in the U.S. And that's all I have, Janelle. So I don't know if you want to, if you have questions that you want to open it up to.
Thank you so much, John, and thank you to Sean as well at the Knoble. We will go ahead and begin with the Q&A portion for today. The first thing I'll address with everybody is we have received a few questions about the ability to download a copy of the slides from today's webinar. That will be available to you, just not quite yet. Once this webinar is wrapped up, we will work on saving a copy of the recording as well as the slides, and it will be available to you on ncua.gov, and we will also post it in the LMS system as well. So that will be available to credit unions there and to the public as well on our website. In terms of the other questions that we received, the first one, John, I think is probably best for you to start with, and then if anybody else wants to jump in, please feel free. But the question is, could you please explain again the difference between consensual commercial sex and how that is considered labor trafficking since there is no force, fraud, or coercion?
Yes, and this is actually, this will lead into another question about the massage parlors. But the way that labor trafficking works when it comes to consensual commercial sex is if it's somebody that is doing it for themselves, right? They're not handing their money over to anybody else, then that's commercial sex, right? But if it's a situation where somebody is engaged in commercial sex and they're turning their money over to a pimp, that's not how labor works, right? That's not how, just think about it. Imagine that, you got your money from your your job, but then you had to take and give, 80% of your money to somebody else. So it's that part of it. It's looking at that transaction, just like you would look at a transaction for a regular business. So forget the fact that this is commercial sex that is involved in that business. Let's make that, instead of consensual commercial sex, make that any other type of labor, and compare those activities to a illicit business and see whether or not they match. Because again, the fact that you're involved in commercial sex, that you're working for somebody, means that that employer has some responsibility towards you, and that's how we get to that.
Thank you, John. Another question that we have is, how does law enforcement handle or address massage places that appear to openly advertise but may not be a legally registered business?
Yeah,
and do you do any other sort of proactive work in that area?
Yeah, so there is a lot of work done in that area. First of all, if you have these businesses and you identify these businesses, as part of your customer base, that's the type of SAR that would be very interested in reading about. And what law enforcement is doing, working with some other private entities, is looking at the business side of this, because looking at how those businesses operate and going after those illicit massage businesses as a labor trafficking scenario, rather than just going, well, they're having sex and they're happy having sex. Okay, fine, but they may be happy having sex, but do they have to live where they work? Like, what are their working hours? What is their schedule? How many days? That's how that's how we are focusing on the massage businesses, by looking at their business operations.
Great, thank you. Another question that was received, and John, you may have some ideas on resources, and Sean, you may as well. Would it be possible to receive a list of prevalent websites that are involved with human trafficking, so that institutions can attempt to look up things that they might see on their core processor or online banking activities of their members?
Yes, I think we can. Janelle, I can work with you to get some of that information. And obviously, that information is rather fluid, because criminal organizations are, it's constantly, the whack-a-mole when it comes to websites. But yes, I can work with Janelle to get some of that.
Thank you. Another question that has come up is, how has COVID affected the red flags or methodologies of human trafficking? Or how do you anticipate that it will?
Well, obviously, big gatherings have stopped, right? And the big sporting events aren't happening right now. But it will come back, right? And can you imagine never having no more people going to the Super Bowl or the World Series or any of these big events? There has been a little bit of a change in that respect. However, trafficking has not slowed down during the pandemic. That is something that it was interesting to see in the first couple of months. We were all sitting back going, okay, how is this gonna what impact is this going to have on trafficking activity? But I can tell you that my agents were actually just as busy, if not busier, during the pandemic, going out, identifying victims, rescuing victims, than they are just pre-pandemic. So it's had a negligible effect. I guess the big events aren't happening, but it does not mean that that's the only time that individuals are victimized.
Thank you. And if a financial institution has concerns and goes ahead and files a SAR, should they take any additional steps to contact law enforcement if they have a particular concern?
Yeah. So even on the SAR, obviously there is a field for, if you want to contact law enforcement. What I would suggest is if you have a concern of somebody being in imminent danger, please go ahead and contact the human trafficking hotline or give the human trafficking hotline information to that person that you believe is in danger. That is the absolute best way to get them help quickly so that, we can begin the process of pulling them from that life. When it comes to banking activity, you can obviously, contact, law enforcement and that's based on the contact that you have. I mean, obviously you guys will have my contact. You can surely reach out to the local HSI office and let us know and say, hey, I have this particular concern with the SAR and I need this to be looked at quickly.
Thank you. And one other quick clarification, John, on that's sort of similar. If a credit union were to have a business account and they bring employees' checks into the branch to cash them, that would be considered a red flag for human trafficking. Is that correct?
Yes, that would be a red flag for human trafficking, but it could also be a red flag for other types of financial crime. It's also oftentimes a red flag for, and it goes hand in hand, right? It could be for somebody who is hiring undocumented workers, and then through that process, they're also labor trafficking.
Thank you. And Sean and John, this may be for both of you, but this next question is, you mentioned, John, about becoming an advocate to help victims of trafficking with bad credit history. How can credit unions accomplish this, and is there any organization or other support that we may be able to provide?
So there are many organizations, the Knoble being one and Polaris being another one, and some of them at the local level. This is where I would ask that each credit union that has the desire to be more involved in fighting and in helping survivors of human trafficking, you may have to do a little bit of legwork locally, but depending on where you are, and I see from the questions, from the companies, the credit unions that are listed here in the question box, that there are people all over the place. But I can guarantee you that there are organizations that are trying to combat human trafficking in each and every single one of your communities.
Yeah, and Janelle, I would just add, this is Sean, I would just add that unfortunately there is not a central place to go with respect to the issue of credit history. When someone's subject to trafficking, it's amazing how many issues they have to deal with after the fact. There are various legal organizations out there that are helping with many of the legal issues that human trafficking survivors face. With respect to credit repair, my best recommendation is to speak to the credit bureaus, and in particular the credit bureau that you may work with the most. So Experian, TransUnion, or Equifax in particular, and helping them get connected through there.
Great, thank you. And from a resource point of view, are either of you aware of places that credit unions may be able to go to talk about frequently asked questions with their own staff and branch people who are on the front lines to have these conversations?
So one of the places is and if I'm hopefully I'm understanding it today, understanding it correctly, is to provide additional information to your employees. The Blue Campaign page is actually really good. That has a lot of different materials, training materials, background materials, contact materials. That would be the place that I would suggest in terms of gathering additional details or to answer some of the questions that your staff may have.
Thank you. And another question that we received, we've got a few more here. Usually a credit union only suspects human trafficking, usually a credit union only suspects human trafficking, but is there any penalty for reporting something to the hotline if they're not sure about its authenticity, but they're still concerned?
Like legal liability for reporting a suspicion of trafficking, is that?
Yes, I believe that's the question. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. No, look, it's that hotline is there. It's anonymous also. It's not like you have to, you can say, hey, look, I suspect that somebody's been trafficked, and it happens all the time. I think really when it comes to legal liability, it's really your intent. If your intent is to help somebody and you turn out to be wrong and you call the hotline, you're just being a concerned citizen. Now, if you're doing it in order to besmirch somebody's reputation from the get-go, then that's an entirely different situation.
Thank you. And another question, John, that we hear a lot about drugging and kidnapping at resorts. Is that more of a hostage ransom type of situation, or is that potentially more in the human trafficking realm?
I think it's going to depend on the very specific set of facts that are involved. A lot of these actually turn out to be neither, right? They'll drug the individual and then they'll rob them. So that's really the most popular type of, when it comes to drugging and clubs and everything else. It's not that they drug and then they're going to take somebody away. So the trafficking is more it's a psychological trick. It actually makes the individuals that become victims believe that the person that is victimizing them is absolutely necessary to their life. Right, so that's more common than being walking down the street and having a white van pull up and having somebody kidnapped off the street. Not to say that doesn't happen, but I can tell you that the instances of that happening are much greatly reduced. And when we're talking about drugging, that's going to be, and we see it in I just worked in South Florida, and some of it happens here in Honolulu also. Go to a bar, meet somebody, they drug you, they take you back to the hotel, and all of a sudden you wake up and you have no money. That's more of an issue.
Thank you. Sean, I think the next question is for you. This credit union has an issue where an elderly member is being scammed and their money is being sent from the victim. They have tried various methods to encourage her to stop sending money, but they refuse to listen. Do you have any other suggestions or resources that the credit union might be able to use to help this particular member in similar situations like this of elder abuse?
Janelle, the best answer I would give would be that follow or create policies that you have at your credit union or recommended by your peers or others, including many of the other financial institutions, the banks that we work with, for when you believe you have the ability to enforce what you need to do to stop the money flow from happening. There are various instances where, unfortunately, it takes a lot of time with the elderly, but there are instances where, with enough time with them, you can help them or enforce a rule that either creates a new account or shuts down an account, working with the consumer for the purpose of stopping the illegal activity. Again, there's not a place to go that I know of or a discrete rule that does that. That would have to be worked within the rules of your financial institution and your customer. But it's not an unusual question or story.
Thank you. John, I think the last question that we have for you today involves the prison system credits that you had mentioned. Can you speak a little bit more about that and what is being done to pay attention to that, to analyze that information? Are there maximums that are allowed to be received into inmates' accounts? How is that being, if you could talk a little bit more about how that process works and what you guys see, that would be helpful.
Yeah, and again, a lot of this is, there is no standard system because we have county jails, we have state jails, we have federal jails, and then you have for-profit jail facilities, right, or for-profit jail companies. So because of that, the difference in the type of facility that individuals are held in, there are a lot of gaps. So there are some, and a lot of it has to do with the operators, whether it's a state operation or whether it's a private operation, the amount of analytic support that they put behind funding these, right? Because there are all sorts of other ways to do that, whether it's via a prepaid card, right, where you can have several people loading a prepaid card and have one prepaid card be the one that is connected to the prison account, or whether it's multiple. It's unfortunately there is no silver bullet on how to do this because the systems are so different, and they have there's no federal or overarching regulation that says that only, that things have to operate in this particular manner, which is why, again, I think that a lot of that, the information that we get on how prison accounts are funded really comes from the industry and the analytical resources and that the industry is able to utilize to identify when you have these situations of that many individuals funding one prison account.
Great. Thank you. That concludes the Q&A for today and the questions that we have received. So we want to thank everyone who participated in today's event, and a special thank you to Homeland Security Investigations and the Knoble for educating us on this important topic. This webinar will be made available publicly in a few weeks once again. And again, thank you for participating today.